So take a second and prepare a quad chart. This is the last video I'm going to make about World War I. It's Unit 1, The Great War Ends, and the essential question is what events led to the end of World War I? We'll start off back in Verdun in 1916. Really, nothing has been achieved from the beginning of World War I until now, and really nothing is achieved for the next year or so in World War I. The French army is completely devastated. The Battle of Verdun, that's in northeast France, is the longest battle of World War I. Remember, that's the artillery battle where the Germans came in and shelled all of those 16 fortresses throughout that region around Verdun. The British operation at the Somme was designed to draw the Germans away from that, but there's very little impact made by the British there. The Germans on every front are suffering a really high level of attrition. It's unsustainable. And Austria-Hungary really is at the brink of complete destruction. If it were not for Germany, they wouldn't be able to continue anything at all. Everyone is looking for that one battle, that one breakthrough, and I think that'll be a theme throughout this little lesson. The French can't do it. They're incapable of any military operations. They're lacking many logistical supplies. Logistics are the things that keep an army running, like ammunition and medicine and food and bullets. So I think that contributes to a really lowering in the morale in the French military. Not that it was very high to begin with, but certainly by this point, 1916, it was very low. Low to the point that mutinies ensue. And I think you guys all know what a mutiny is. Some people get together and try to overthrow the leadership. And in most cases, generally every army universally, the penalty in wartime for mutiny is death. And the French put to death a lot of soldiers who tried to form mutinies, who tried to overthrow their leaders. Some were shot, but in some instances, and this is brutal, they would march unarmed men, sometimes 250 men at a time, out into no man's land to be riddled with machine gun fire and killed by artillery. That just gives you a sense on what the French were dealing with in morale and how they chose to deal with it. The burden at this point in time falls on the BEF, or the British Expeditionary Forces. And a place they choose to engage now, looking for a breakthrough, is a place called Passchendaele, which you watched a short video of the Battle of Passchendaele over the weekend. You could tell just by that one video scene, the terrain was pretty treacherous. It was very wet and muddy and barren. This is a place that is again located up here in Belgium, and a region that's referred to as Flanders. If you ever do any studying or reading about World War I, they'll talk about Flanders a lot. A lot of poetry in the British Army was written about this place. It was a nice village that it was built on an aqueduct system because it's in a wetland. So what happens, you think, to that village when this 3.5 million shells falls on those aqueducts and shatters them? They're all made out of stone. So it shatters them. It was the only thing keeping the water from swamping out the village. And here you see Passchendaele at the beginning of the battle. Here you see Passchendaele during the battle at the bottom. And obviously all those little circles are artillery impacts, but they crushed that aqueduct system. All of the water comes rushing back into that region and just kind of floods it. And that's what the men had to fight through. And this is really what it looks like. Barren landscape, everything's destroyed, water's everywhere and flooded. I want to read you a quote from the book that a lot of this course is based on. The slope was littered with dead, both theirs and ours. I got to one pillbox to find it just a mass of dead, so I passed on carefully to the one ahead. Here I found about 50 men alive, of the Manchesters. I've never seen men so broken or demoralized. They were huddled up close behind the box in the last stages of exhaustion and fear. The Germans had been sniping them off all day, and it counted for 57 that day. The dead and dying lay in piles. The wounded were numerous, unattended, and so weak they groaned. Some have been laying there for already 4 days. After this battle, General Haig, the commander of the British Expeditionary Forces, finally looked at the battlefield. He'd never seen the battlefield leading up to or during the battle. But after the battle, he makes this comment: "Good God, did we really send men to fight in that?" I think that speaks volumes on the leadership of the British Expeditionary Forces. So we see a lot of really failed attempts and failed leadership during a lot of World War I, and especially in the Battle of Passchendaele. Germany also is trying to make a breakthrough, right? So General Ludendorff had formed the stormtroopers initially, but now he wants to expand that into a much larger force. So he trains 40 elite divisions. These divisions get the best soldiers, the best non-commissioned officers, and the best officers. So they got the best fighters and they get the best leaders. They get them the best training available, make them very elite, and they provide them with the state-of-the-art equipment that nobody else has. What effect do you think that has on the German army as a whole? If you drain the best fighters, the best leadership, the best equipment, and give them the best training, well, the German army starts to experience a similar problem that the French army had with morale. The remainder of the units are ineffective. They cannot keep up with what the stormtroopers are doing. And what they're doing is this new tactic called attack in depth. So if you remember defense in depth, we talked about early on in World War I, they'd start by spreading machine gun positions all the way across no man's land. Instead of having just no man's land in the trench, the Germans' enemies, had to fight all the way through these machine gun positions, getting killed, taking casualties, until they finally made it into the frontline infantry trench. Well, attack in depth is kind of a similar tactic. Instead of fighting across the long line, they would identify a weak spot in the enemy's lines, and they would attack deep and penetrate and wreak havoc, do as much damage as they could in the rear, and then they would avoid decisive combat. They would get back and cross back through the enemy's lines so that they could regroup and fight another day. So far, America hasn't gotten into this at all, but we start to see the move toward supporting forces in Europe during World War I. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, said we must maintain staunch neutrality. But did we really? I mean, no, we didn't send people to fight in World War I initially. We didn't send them to Europe, but we were sending supplies. We were sending food. We were selling them weapons. We were benefiting monetarily from this. And I think that we picked sides whether we decided to fight against them or not. So, and there were a lot of people who wanted to fight. There were a lot of people who, with those heritages, right? The German heritage, or the German Americans felt allegiance to the Germans that were fighting there. And some of them even did go over and fight. And then, of course, British, with our own background with England, the majority of the Americans supported the Allies in this. A lot of people believe that the sinking of the Lusitania is the catalyst and the reason that we got involved in World War I. And that's just not true. The Lusitania was sunk in 1915, and at that time, President Wilson went to the Kaiser and said, "This is wrong. You can't sink merchant ships, and we will get involved if that continues to happen." So the Kaiser backs off, and he says, "Okay, we're not gonna sink any more of these merchant ships." Obviously, Germany didn't want additional forces moved into Europe to fight against them. But if you recall, I told you a couple of lessons ago about these military dictators. And one of these military dictators decided that they would restart the unlimited or unrestrained submarine warfare and attacks against merchant ships coming across the ocean. And really for good reason, because they're supplying weapons, ammunition, food, whatever to their enemies. And despite the number of people that were killed in the Lusitania, and that some people in Congress even wanted to go to war then, it takes another year and a half before this submarine warfare is going to start again, and we actually get involved. And we find out about that with the Zimmerman telegram, intercepted and decoded. I'll give you a second to read over the telegram here. Essentially what it says is we are going to begin unrestricted submarine warfare, and we're going to stop this flow of supplies that are harming the German army across the ocean. And they approached Mexico, and they said, if you'll be our partner in this, you can have back, we will support you, you can attack America, and we will help you get back the lands that you've lost from America. Well, that was unacceptable to the president and to our government. And the next day, or a couple days later, President Wilson goes to Congress and gets them to declare war on Germany. Some actual artifacts here. This is from the Truman Library a couple of years ago, but this is the actual Zimmermann telegram. So it doesn't look like the picture that I showed you. It's an encoded telegram. These are sealed behind glass, but that's just the decoded version of the Zimmermann telegram. And this, I know it's difficult to see, but this is the ship's manifest from the Lusitania. And if you read this, it says that there are X number, I think it's 6 cases of fuses. Now, there's several pages of this, but it's obvious that even though there were Americans on board and they were warned not to go on these other flagged ships, that we were using those ships to send supplies over to the British to be used against the Germans. And in so, I think most people would agree that that makes this a legitimate target. So America does get involved in World War I, and they start to send troops over to Europe. And the troops that we send over are called doughboys. It's an informal name that refers to really all the ground forces that fought in Europe in World War I, both Marines and the Army. Germans realize, like everybody else, that they've got to quickly end this. They've got to look for that final Napoleonic victory to break the British back. And General Ludendorff really realizes he's got to do this before America gets involved in the war. The last thing that they want is a fresh influx of fighters into Europe that haven't been exposed to the combat that both sides have been exposed to so far. And in doing this, he relies on the stormtroopers, which, as his best units, it's understandable. But units like that can't sustain high operational tempo for a long period of time without support. And after the rest of the German army is kind of left useless at this point in time, that's both Ludendorff's only option and also probably his greatest mistake. Fresh troops do arrive from the west, and the French and the British both think we're going to plug them right in the holes in the lines, and they'll just fight alongside British and French under their commanders. And that's not the way America is really choosing to do this. We're going to send all of our guys over to fight under one general. It's going to be General John J. Pershing. He's the commander of all forces in Europe during World War I. And we send a total of initially 2 million people, about 10,000 a day arrive in France. And they're as units get there, they're moved out on the lines under U.S. commanders. And they don't experience a lot of success. Their first combat is along the Marne River. It's really a disaster. They take a lot of casualties, but they have this energy and this motivation that even though they're not performing very well, they raise the morale of the French and the British. And we start to see that they believe that they can last a little bit longer as long as they have American support. So Germany is going to make one final push. And I know it sounds like that in World War I. It's one more operation, one big push to try to end the war. But that's what this whole war was about. Was trying to make that one operation that ends it quickly. For Germany, this is going to be Operation Michael, and it's going to be the last offensive that they put together, and in an attempt to just break through the enemy lines. And they believe if they can break through the enemy lines, that they could cause the British to fail, and they would be able to be successful. And this is just before the arrival of American forces into Europe when this operation begins. It's actually 4 operations, or 4 phases of operations. They attack, settle in, find out where their gaps are, attack again at a weak spot in the German forces, and they end up creating this large bulge or salient here in the British lines. But it's all for naught. It doesn't last very long. At the beginning of Operation Michael, it's kind of interesting. General Ludendorff was asked what the operational objective was. And he said, "We will punch a hole in the line. For the rest, we shall see." So not a great plan when it came to it. As you can see, they did indeed start to punch a hole in the line, but they couldn't support it logistically. They couldn't sustain that, particularly after the arrival of U.S. forces. And another thing, he relies entirely on the stormtroopers to do this. They're very, very disciplined, but they can't maintain that type of operational tempo. They suffer high amount of killed in action, and that discipline begins to fade. Which brings us to the Battle of the Argonne Forest. This is the place where America really makes its name in World War I. And it's also the first place we see true combined arms maneuver. We see artillery being employed against other artillery, not just against men out on the battlefield. We see tanks used to cover the advancing infantry across no man's land. We see fire and maneuver and support from multiple facets that hasn't been employed in World War I in the past. So it's General Pershing's operation. He seeks to punch 1.2 million troops, 40,000 tons of supplies right through the enemy's line. And really, it's the largest and still today the most deadliest operation conducted in U.S. history. And it does. It crushes the Germans. They fall one position after another. They go through 6 divisions. 2/3 of them become prisoners of war. And in fact, as the Germans are retreating and running away to reinforcements being sent up, they try to stop them. They say, hey, they don't go up there. It's a lost cause. The German army had given up. And in a sense, really, the Germans in whole had lost already. So how do we save what remains? How do we change from a world of monarchies to democratic republics? Well, the armistice signed on November 3rd from Austria-Hungary initially. The Ottoman Empire and Turkey withdraws because there's an Arab revolt going on inside that region of the world. And this is when we see those Arab countries that are in such turmoil today carved up into nations. So we've got Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and the Transjordan region. And they draw these borders across tribal lines. And the British are the ones that go in and do this without really any cultural sensitivity at all. And so the combat, the conflicts we see between each other and the West in those nations is really the end of World War I and how Western nations went in and decided where countries would be on hard borders like rivers and such instead of across cultural and tribal lines. The Kaiser leaves Germany, abdicates the throne, and on November 11th, hostilities cease. And finally, the Allies get together and they want to punish Germany. France particularly wants to punish Germany. And they do this through the Treaty of Versailles. And really, through that punishment, set the stage for what becomes the rise of Germany in World War II. And how does that happen? Well, first of all, they make Germany accept blame for what happened in World War I, even though they were really just doing what everybody else was doing. They were supporting Austria-Hungary based on their alliances. Austria-Hungary actually was the catalyst there with Serbia, right? Not Germany. Germany didn't fire the first shot. Germany didn't try to take over the world in World War I. They then make Germany give up land that they've taken and some of the land on those borders to provide a buffer in France. France really, really angry after this. They make them pay war reparations to France, which they don't have any money. They don't have any economy after the war either, so that's very difficult. They end up borrowing money from America to do that. They dissolve the army down to just a national force, and really they force the German people to accept a lot of shame. And as a proud people that really didn't sit well with the German population, and I think contributed a lot to the development of those animosities that come and bring us into World War II. But, understandably, France really had reason to want to punish Germany. If you look at this, how much of their land was destroyed. Remember the pictures you saw before and after shots of different places. Look at the amount of livestock and the buildings that they lost. France really paid the ultimate price in terms of what it lost in infrastructure. In deaths, you can see that the Russians, at least on the Allied side, the Russians experienced the most amount of deaths, and the United States came in last and had really the fewest amount of deaths in there. Germany experienced the most amount of deaths for the Central Powers, but they also did the majority of the fighting. And that wraps up World War I. We used to do a simulation on the Treaty of Versailles, and I think most of you do that in in U.S. history. So we won't do that simulation. But if you don't remember that, before we get into World War I, it would be prudent, I think, to do a little bit of digging on the specific items in the Treaty of Versailles and why that left the German population really susceptible to this rhetoric that develops out of the nationalistic Nazism that comes with Hitler before we go into World War II.